Well, welcome to the first of the Discoveris Lecture and the Learning Series program of the academic year. This program kicks off the fourth year of the series, and it remains a cornerstone in the philosophy of the College of Arts and Sciences to extend the learning community to alumni and reflect the breadth of a liberal arts education. We have an extremely interesting topic tonight, the role of social media in political uprisings. And I was thinking over, as I came over tonight, that so much of modern technology has seemed to make the prospects of control greater. There are better surveillance cameras. There are more powerful computers to gather material on all of us and to mold it together. And so at times one can become a little bit depressed about the impact of technology on the opportunities for political participation and uprisings against authoritarian regimes. And yet, in recent times, we have been given this glimmer of hope that maybe social media provides a countervailing force, something that will enable people to overcome the barriers of communication between them that are so eagerly maintained by despotic and authoritarian regimes. And whether or not that ray of hope is something that we will be able to cling on to after the presentations tonight, I don't know. It may well be that our speakers will tell me not to set my hopes too high. But compared with some of the other impacts of technology on the potential for social and political control, at least it seemed to me that there was a glimmer of hope there. We're delighted to have with us tonight two excellent speakers, Azer, Bestavros, and Boas, both from the Arts and Sciences faculty. Azer is a member of the Computer Science Department, has been at BU since 1991. He served as the chair of the department from 2000 to 2007, and as somebody into their second year of a chairmanship, I can only salute you and admire your fortitude in serving a 7-year sentence. He pursues research in the broad areas of networking and real-time embedded systems. As of June 2010, his research has yielded 14 PhD theses, 4 issued patents, 2 startup companies, and hundreds of refereed papers that are cited over 4,700 times. And he's received over $18 million of grants from government agencies and industrial labs. What a contribution, not only to BU, but to academic life in general. He grew up in Alexandria, Egypt, attended Alexandria University, and obtained his PhD in computer science from Harvard University. Azer identifies as a Coptic Christian, and of course, our thoughts recently have been very much with that community and the question of the challenges that they face in the new Egypt. The last time he visited Egypt was in 2009-2010, where he spent part of his sabbatical at the Microsoft Research Center in Cairo. Azer is the founding director of one of the most exciting developments at BU right now, which is the Hariri Institute for Computing and Computational Science and Engineering, created in 2010 to create and sustain a community of scholars who believe in the transformative potential of computational perspectives in research and education by the generous gift of Bahar Hariri, a graduate of the School of Management and a Boston University trustee. This is an exciting initiative that will link across math and the sciences into the social sciences and is of great interest to some of my colleagues, which brings me to one of them, Boas. Taylor's only been here since 2009, but he's already one of those people where you can't really imagine the department without him. He makes a tremendous contribution, teaching methodology to the graduate students, teaching introduction to comparative politics to the freshmen, and above all, fostering the study of and understanding of Latin America and Latin American politics. When I started out in political science, there was something of the attitude that you could find either people with skills and strong methodological backgrounds coming out of graduate schools, or you could find people coming out of graduate schools with a deep knowledge of a particular country or region. Now, in my view, the younger people are much smarter, more able, and better trained than my generation, and Taylor exemplifies this because he gives you both. He really has that deep knowledge of Latin America, of the languages and culture, but he combines that with very sophisticated knowledge, training, and ability in quantitative research techniques. So he really, the slogan, "You can have it all," with Taylor, we got it all. His publications include articles in World Politics, Studies in Comparative International Development, the Journal of Theoretical Politics, and Latin American Research Review. He's also co-author, coming back to tonight's topic, of Open Networks, Closed Regimes, the Impact of the Internet on Authoritarian Rule. And so I think you'll agree that we have two tremendous speakers for the program tonight, and we're so grateful to them for coming. Azer, are you going to start, or how are you going to do this? Taylor is going to start this. Well, wrong guess, but I look forward to both. Thank you.
Well, thanks to Graham for those kind remarks. Graham is my department chair and thus essentially my boss, so I'm particularly appreciative that he has such nice things to say. And thank you also to the organizers and to everybody who came out tonight. And Azer and I have some remarks, and then we look forward to a nice discussion afterwards as well. The first protests brought together thousands of ordinary citizens calling for the reform of a regime that had ruled over them for 40 years and had always responded to previous demonstrations with violent crackdowns and arrests. When regime leaders finally gave in and handed power to a transitional government, protesters in neighboring countries were immediately emboldened. In the following months, millions of citizens poured into public squares in their capital cities, calling for the downfall of long-standing authoritarian regimes. In some cases, authorities gave in to peaceful protests. In others, violent struggle was necessary before dictators could be removed. And in still others, repression of demonstrators was successful at keeping the regime in place. But no one could deny the stunning wave of revolt against a series of autocrats that were once thought to be unshakable. Commenting on these events, a distinguished professor of government at Harvard University remarked that new communication media made it increasingly difficult for authoritarian governments to keep from their elites and even their publics information on the struggles against and the overthrow of authoritarian regimes in other countries. The quote is from Samuel P. Huntington in his book, The Third Wave, and the year was 1991. The phenomenon to which he was referring is the fall of authoritarian regimes in the late 1980s, particularly communist regimes in Eastern Europe. The new media to which he was making reference are shortwave radio, satellite television, computers, and fax machines. I bring this example up because the fall of communism in 1989 has striking parallels to the Arab Spring of 2011. And comparing these two episodes and the role of communication media in each one can help us figure out what is new and unique about the latter. Like the Arab Spring, revolutions against communism in 1989 spread rapidly, and they brought down multiple regimes within months. Poland, and then Hungary, and then East Germany, and then Czechoslovakia, and then Bulgaria and Romania. In most cases, as in Tunisia and Egypt, authoritarian leaders eventually stepped down or negotiated the transition in the face of massive demonstrations. In Romania, as in Libya, much more violence was necessary in order to bring down a personalistic dictator by force. In China's Tiananmen Square protests, demands for political reform were met with repression, and the regime ultimately stayed in place, which is what happened in Iran in 2009, and may ultimately be the fate of uprisings in much of the rest of the region. As Huntington's quote suggests, communication media were thought at the time to play a crucial role in the fall of communism. Cell phones had barely been invented. Email was still in its infancy. The internet as we know it would not exist for years, much less social media. But radio and TV broadcasts from neighboring countries are an important part of that story. In East Germany, a government spokesman's mistaken interpretation of instructions to allow limited border crossings was picked up by West German television, leading to massive crowds at the Berlin Wall that ultimately prompted border guards to open the gates. In Czechoslovakia, massive protests against the regime materialized seemingly out of nowhere after television coverage of events in Poland, Hungary, and East Germany. In Romania, protests spread to the capital and brought down Ceausescu after Radio Free Europe and Voice of America reported on violent crackdowns against protesters in a border region. And yet we also know that the effect of foreign television broadcasts on communist regimes was more complicated than simply the events that led to their fall. During most of East Germany's history, those who had access to West German television broadcasts were more satisfied with the regime because entertainment programs provided an escape from the difficult realities of everyday life. So 10 years after the fall of the communism, I was working in Washington, D.C. at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, a foreign policy think tank, on a project entitled The Information Revolution in World Politics. This was the period of the internet boom when it seemed like the stock market would keep on going up forever and every college graduate could find a job at a tech startup. And there was a lot of enthusiasm and optimism in D.C. at the time about the political effects of new media. This was the period in which, in 2000, Bill Clinton famously said of China's efforts to control the internet that this was like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall. For scholars who studied the political effect of communication media, the internet was supposed to be more conducive to democracy than radio and television because it was a many-to-many medium that was supposedly more difficult to control from a single point. So rather than taking over a broadcasting tower or a transmission tower or a broadcasting studio, an authoritarian regime would supposedly need to control thousands of individual users who could each send email or access a website. The same is true of cell phone text messaging, which also proliferated in the 1990s. We saw during this period that the internet and related technologies facilitated political movements against a number of authoritarian regimes. In 1998, students in Indonesia used email to coordinate protests that ultimately led to the downfall of the Suharto regime. In 1999, followers of Falun Gong, a spiritual practice in China, used the internet to coordinate a gathering of 10,000 members in front of the Chinese leadership compound in response to prior government crackdowns on the movement. Of course, use of new media in the late 1990s and early 2000s also facilitated political challenges against democratic regimes and international organizations. In the Philippines, mobile text messaging was crucial for organizing protests in 2001 that led to the downfall of President Joseph Estrada, whose government was corrupt but not anti-democratic. And in the United States in 1999, organizing on the internet allowed tens of thousands of anti-globalization protesters to paralyze downtown Seattle during the meetings of the World Trade Organization, numbers that go well beyond what we've seen in the current Occupy Wall Street and Occupy Boston events. It was clear in 1999 that new media could facilitate protests against authoritarian regimes as well as democratic ones. The political impact of the internet and related technologies was more complicated than simply facilitating protest. In a 2003 book, Open Networks and Closed Regimes, that I co-authored with Shanti Klethel, we argued that some uses of the internet pose challenges to authoritarian regimes, but their leaders may be able to effectively respond to these challenges, and other uses of the internet serve to strengthen authoritarian rule. The subsequent 8 years since we published this book has largely borne out our predictions. Most authoritarian regimes we examined remain solidly in place, even though internet use has proliferated and new social media such as Twitter and Facebook have arisen and become popular. In China, where optimists had once hoped that Western internet firms would bring freedom of information, Yahoo, Google, and others cooperated for years with the government's censorship efforts. Last year, Google stopped filtering its searches and then pulled out of mainland China. But this was largely a response to its Gmail servers being hacked by Chinese authorities, rather than being a political statement per se. Interestingly, the only authoritarian regime we examined in this book that has since fallen is the one that at the time placed the least restrictions on the internet, which is Egypt. So this brings me to the role of social media in recent uprisings in the Arab world and beyond. It is undoubtedly the case that social media like Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube are useful as a logistical tool for organizing protests against authoritarian regimes as well as democratic regimes. We've seen it used not only by demonstrators in Tahrir Square in Cairo, but also by the Occupy Wall Street and Occupy Boston protesters and the London riots several months ago. Twitter makes it much easier for one individual to get a message out to millions of followers worldwide, much easier than it was the case with simply email and even text messaging or traditional websites. It is even more many-to-many than earlier forms of new media, so it's accelerated many of the same trends that we saw in the late 1990s. Social media also make it much easier to get information out to the rest of the world, whether it is about the military firing on protesters and authoritarian regimes, or excessive use of force by police against protesters in a democracy, like many Occupy Boston participants are now charging. Traditional media play a crucial role here as well, such as when Al Jazeera broadcasts videos that were initially posted on YouTube, or photos and videos from the Occupy events get posted on CNN.com's iReport. So for me as a political scientist, the larger question that I've always been interested in is, what are the political effects of these uses of new media? This is where I think that the hype in the news media goes somewhat beyond the evidence, just like Bill Clinton did in 2000 when he said that controlling the internet in China was like nailing Jell-O to the wall. The media have dubbed the Arab Spring the Twitter revolution, or at least you see that repeated from time to time. But I don't think that it was the Twitter revolution any more than the fall of communism was the television revolution. In both cases, revolutions were made by people in the street that were assisted by the use of technology. It's somewhat hard to envision the use of social media in an authoritarian regime having any political effect on its own. There's some evidence that it can do so in a democracy. So for instance, people argue that a social media campaign in Spain after the 2004 Madrid bombing, train bombing, which was 3 days before Spain's general election, was able to change the outcome by shifting votes away from the popular party of incumbent Jose Maria Aznar and in favor of the opposition with Zapatero, who was opposed to the war in Iraq. To bring down an authoritarian regime, you need something more than changing minds. You need to mobilize people to go to the street where they would otherwise not have done so. And any short-term effects of the use of social media on authoritarian regimes will always involve this type of concrete political action, and often people that are willing to give their lives. So if we're interested in whether social media facilitated protests can bring down an authoritarian regime, we also have to pay attention to factors other than people in the streets. This past February, there was a boost in discussions of the Arab Spring in Chinese social media. And there was also an upsurge in real physical protests on the streets. So this sort of activity, several weeks after the events in Tunisia and Egypt, had a number of analysts asking, is China next? But China is a very different type of authoritarian regime than those in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya. One way, and there are a number of different examples of this, but one major distinction between them concerns the mechanisms that are in place for leadership succession. So Hu Jintao in China was chosen by an institutionalized succession process. His term in office is subject to term limits, and he's going to be replaced with a new Chinese president in a few years. In contrast, Ben Ali, Muammar Gaddafi, and Hosni Mubarak all came to power through irregular mechanisms that involved violence, and that they had been in office for 2 to 4 decades before they were eventually overthrown. And they showed no plans to leave on their own. Personalistic dictatorships like these that were overthrown in the Arab Spring may look stable on the outside, but they are inherently more vulnerable to spontaneous collapse. In Egypt, it was crucial that the military turned their backs on Mubarak. Top officers who had secretly wanted to see him removed from power may have seen this as their one opportunity to act. The same thing is much less likely to happen in China, precisely because there is an institutionalized process through which new leaders are chosen on a regular basis. So I want to close with one reflection on what might be legitimately something new about the role of social media in the Arab Spring compared to the fall of communism in 1989. Azer and I were talking about this question several months ago, and we agreed that social media makes it much easier for small events, such as a vegetable seller setting himself on fire in Tunisia, to spark a chain reaction. If you think about, in contrast, the fall of communism in Poland, which was the first of the Eastern European revolutions, this is the culmination of 9 years of political organizing by an opposition labor union, Solidarity. And I think we agree this is a major difference between now and then, and with that, I will turn it over to him.
Well, first, I want to thank you all for being here today, and I want to thank Graham for his very great introduction. It's a bit humbling to come after Taylor with all this history. And also it's a little humbling because I have to admit this is the first time I'm making a presentation without PowerPoint, not related to computer science or networking, so we'll see how this goes. I wanted to share with you a couple of perspectives. The first one is my personal experience with social media as an Egyptian living in Wayland and 3 kids, no dogs, but have been out of touch for a while from Egypt. And what social media, what I observed in that period, for maybe 4 weeks, I think I was totally glued to my computer. I have still family in Egypt. I'm the only one who's here. And it was a real experience that I now look back, and it really had a very deep influence on me. So there's a bunch of points I want to go through. First one is that for me, and I'm not speaking for anybody else, social media was the only source of information about what was happening in Egypt. It was way ahead of CNN, of Fox. So I found it very interesting that it did replace traditional media outlet in terms of just following the information. Second, I lived in Egypt for 25 years before I came here. And schools, university, friends. One thing in Egypt is you basically are in the same milieu. You don't cross, you don't see the other side, you don't see how people in the villages live. As Graham mentioned, I'm a minority Coptic Christian. Well, I have lots of Muslim friends, but we never ever talk about things that could be sort of difficult. One thing that the social media allowed during the time of the revolution was it enabled communication across ideological, religious, and age divide. Something I have never done for 25 years living there. For example, it enabled me to participate in the revolution. I'm living here. I would have never been able to feel that I'm part of it if it were not for social media. It's very interesting. So I had all my friends on Facebook, and I follow people on Twitter, right? I think I maybe doubled the number of friends I have just in the first week. And they are not the kind of friends I would have added at all. Some of them are very different than I. Some of them have very different ideologies in terms of what they want Egypt to be like, for example. Some of them are in their 20s. They happen to be, I don't know, a friend of a cousin or something of this sort. I was very open to have friends. I mean, these are not real friends. It's just people that ask to connect with me so that we can chat, we can exchange ideas. Not only that, but I have to admit something else. I sort of inserted myself. I asked to be friends with people for the only purpose of finding out how they think. So, as many of you know, for example, in Egypt, there are strong movements related to the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, and I know that many of my friends are devout Muslims. I wanted to find out, how are they thinking about this? And Facebook and social media allows that, because all of a sudden, they accept my friendship. They're not necessarily writing on their wall or on their friend's wall, knowing that I'm reading. So it gives you this opportunity to see what other people who are very unlike you are thinking. I thought that was quite revealing for me. Another thing which is very obvious, I'm going to the next bullet here, is that propaganda, in my opinion, with social media is no longer a tool for government. all you need is a PC. And then you can be as powerful as government in terms of propaganda. In Egypt, newspapers and TVs were all controlled by, Mubarak. And what I've seen in the revolution is that social media was used by ordinary people just like me to also spread propaganda about the revolution. In other words, spreading half-truths. Why? Because they want people to go to the streets. So in many ways, the social media was used by the activists as a propaganda tool to get people to the streets. How do you do that? Well, it doesn't hurt that you can Photoshop some pictures and you have pictures of Mubarak's family landing in Heathrow with bags of Egypt treasures. And of course, that gets people very upset, right? And you see you don't believe it. And you see how it sort of gets people to excited, and now they down on the Mubarak, etc. So I've seen that. Another thing I want to mention, another point, is that the nature of social media promotes hyperbole and crowd psychology. Let me explain what I mean by this. A newspaper, you read every day. Maybe TV, you wait for the hour to hear the news. Not the case with Twitter and Facebook. These things come in real time. You see it, and you can interact with it. You can react to it. You can post a comment on Facebook. And I think this fast feedback loop, the very short feedback loop, makes for a very interesting psychology that develops. It amplifies emotions. I think that usually if you wait just for a day and you read the posting again, you may not react the same way. So this is something I really noticed. It amplifies emotions. It really elicits atypical reactions and responses. People I knew, I would have never expected what they say or what they do. And I mean, I'm not a social scientist, I'm not a psychologist, but I think it is hard to resist the heat of the moment with social media. I remember posting, I was getting tired of this, so I actually posted on my own wall something like, think before you post. Because some of the things were just propagated and people are, without thinking about what they're writing. I mean, another point here related to this is also the fact that social media has these images with it. So, pictures of martyrs, etc. They call them martyrs, by the way. These are victims. How many of you remember the face of a young woman with sort of brown curly hair that made it as, well, this is one of the victims of the Tahrir Square? How many of you remember that face? It's a face to remember. I do. Well, the story with that face is that this young lady died in a totally unrelated accident. It just happened to die the day when there were all these Tahrir Square crowds. And the activists decided to use that picture, which is very powerful. The father and mother of that young lady came a week later and says she didn't die in any protest. She just fell off the balcony. I think that's what the story is. And nobody cared. They still, until today, this picture is used. Pictures are very powerful, and I think that's an example of it. That's why people do it. I have to say that at the end of this sort of weeks of being in the social media, I felt a little dazed. I think it's almost like too much noise. And let me finish my sort of personal experiences with maybe a scary thought. I do believe that social media is becoming a tool for manipulating public opinion, in the sense that now people are starting to understand how you can get people to do things they wouldn't do otherwise with social media. Let me give you one example. So Egypt's constitution states that the official religion of Egypt is Islam, which, of course, for people who are liberal, that doesn't make sense. There's other people. Well, in any case, that's the constitution in Egypt. And of course, with the revolution, there was all sorts of pages about changing the Constitution. Let's remove that article. Now the question is, who is actually promoting these pages? You would expect, I don't know, maybe a Christian promoting it, or maybe somebody who was secular. Well, the truth of the matter is, those who were pushing these pages were Islamists. Why? Because that helped move their own base to go vote in a particular way. There was some vote about, the Constitution, whether to approve it or not, etc. So that's an example of, it is not clear who's doing what on social media and for what purpose. And I do believe that that's a big question that sort of leaves me a little bit scared. Now I'm going to move something I can talk about a little bit more comfortably, which is technical aspects. So this is not my personal perspective anymore. And the one message I want you to take out is that the use of social media for activism is not without risks. It's actually fraught with risks. So let me give you some example. Clandestine government influencers, what I like to call, so in Egypt there's these thugs. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about. The government has these thugs that try to just create trouble. Well, there are internet thugs. There are social media thugs. They actually are learning how to use that medium, and here are things they can do. They can do social honeypots. What is that? Well, if I want to find out who is really troublemaker, I'm sort of working for the government now, intelligence. Well, all I have to do is create a very nice page and get people to like it and sign up and post on it. Guess what? They just have to identify themselves. In computer science, we use that approach to find viruses, right? So we put computers that are totally unprotected, unlike your PC at home. Hopefully you have some virus protection. Well, we put a computer without virus protection. We just want it to be infected. Why? Because if it doesn't have any virus protection, it will be infected fast. And then we go in and find how to come up with the right vaccines. Well, guess what? There are social honeypots, which is a way to sort of attract those you want to go to that website. I mentioned that when I was the beginning of the revolution, all sorts of people wanted to be my friends. Many of them I didn't know. So question, friend or informant? How do you know who's really want to follow you or what have you? And that brings the question, the technical question that's very interesting. How do you establish trust with computers and social media? It's one thing to go to the street and shake somebody's hand and know that this is my brother or my sister. But it's, social media, I do not know who's on the other end of it. Now, how do you do that? Well, one way is probably to provide some more feedback than the like button. How about something like bogus or liar or something like that? Now, of course, I may want to do that with anonymity because I don't want, but then brings the question, how do you know that the person doing that is not just bad-mouthing somebody? Last week, I had a visitor from CMU who showed me a very interesting application. It's on phones. And he says, look, the only way you can befriend somebody is you have to know them. And you have to have a handshake, a physical handshake. And now you can establish a relationship. You can communicate with social media. I think what we need is the notion of a handshake for relating to each other with social media. Another thought on sort of the technical side is anonymity is a double-edged sword. I mentioned that we need some anonymity so that we can start sort of telling people what to really think about what they're doing. Why is it a double-edged sword? Because first, user can express their ideas more freely. If you can say what you want, you probably are not going to worry about somebody tracking you. But with the same token, users can spread lies, false alarms. The case in point here is the gay girl in Damascus. Do you know the story of the blogger who, just a story about a gay girl in Damascus. And, you can imagine it was almost going to get to, war. So, well, that's what anonymity does if it's left unchecked. So how do we balance anonymity and veracity? We need both. How do you do that? That's a technical challenge. That's something we hope that maybe in computer science we can try to solve. Another thing which is very important is the amounts of data out there. Data mining of new media. Who owns that data? Twitter? Facebook? You, I, governments? The governments that the data flows through? It's interesting, right? And who do we trust with access to that data? And what does that data tell us about society? I think there were articles in the New York Times a few days ago about how, had they known, they could have predicted the fall of Mubarak like a month before just by the traffic on Twitter, for example, because they can measure it. You know that Google is able to tell when flu outbreaks are going to happen just by looking at the keyword searches for flu symptoms. And they can tell where, because they know where the queries came from. So now we can do the same thing. We have live pulse in real time of millions of people. Perhaps we can mine this and basically predict how society is going to go, including whether revolutions or unrest or what have you. Very powerful. And finally, I cannot not mention the internet kill switch. One thing that Mubarak had. Somehow he let the internet be, as Taylor mentioned, probably less manager controlled, but he did have that kill switch. I don't know, it's not a real switch, but he had it somehow in the contract of all these companies that the government can instruct you to turn off the internet. I remember that happening. And as a networking person, it was like fascinating to see how it just dropped to zero in like 5 minutes. It's unbelievable. So, well, by the way, this act, I think, accelerated his demise. I think people were really upset. People went to the street because they didn't have the internet. So it really backfired, just as an anecdotal note here. I do believe that access to information is a right. As a matter of fact, the United Nations just had passed a resolution along the lines that access to information is a human right, access to the internet. You cannot just take it away. Okay? Question, do we need a kill switch? Well, the internet also can be used for bad things. Should it be possible for the president to turn off the internet because it's a clear and present danger? I don't know. Well, but to answer that, we computer scientists don't like the idea of anybody turning off the internet. So people are working on, well, ad hoc internet. You know, if you think about Egypt, they really didn't need the internet. They just needed a way to communicate with each other. They all had cell phones. Well, they turned off the cell phone towers. But you don't need cell phone towers because each phone can talk to the phone right next to it. And you can make a network that we call ad hoc network that way. So there are people today that are actually working on this so that if in some other country there is such a turn off the internet, well, we can deal with that too. Now a final thought, and I'm going to close with a remark very similar to what Taylor mentioned. We discussed it together, and we both agree that this is a very interesting observation. But let me tell you, I relate it to chaos theory. That's the theory of mathematics. So in chaos theory, the butterfly effect is the sensitive dependence on initial conditions. It goes like this. A small change in one place may result in a very large impact later and in another place. Often illustrated, this phenomena of the butterfly effect, often illustrated by rhetorical questions such as, does the flap of a butterfly's wings in Brazil set off a tornado in Texas? Well, chaotic systems, mathematically chaotic systems, yeah, that can happen. A very small change in initial conditions can result in very, very different outcomes. Unpredictability, basically. Well, rephrasing, and of course the answer to this is no, because the world is not that chaotic anyway. But if it were, then that would have happened for, let's say, weather. Rephrasing this rhetorical question in the social media context, I can ask, does the protest of a fruit seller in Tunisia set off a revolution in Egypt? And here the answer I contend is yes, which is surprising. And it tells you something. It tells you, well, because it's a chaotic place, if you think about all the things I said about people reacting sort of a little bit irrational, it becomes, there is a little bit of chaos in this medium. And that may just take something very small like this and blow it out of proportion, result in a revolution in Egypt. This does not mean, though, that the revolution in Egypt would not have happened if it were not for the fruit seller. In other words, I'm not saying that the revolution would not have happened, but it could have been some other small event somewhere else. It does mean that predicting what might spark a revolution and how such a revolution might evolve has become that much harder. Thank you.
Thank you both for such interesting presentations. I think both of you touched on China as a particularly important case where change had not quite happened. I wonder, before we open it up to the audience, could I just ask you to clarify, because I read contradictory things, about how possible it is for the Chinese government to close off access through the internet to knowledge. Sometimes I hear people saying that's pretty easy to do. Other times I hear people saying that, well, you know, all you've got to do is to get a VPN or something like that, and you're home free.
Okay, it's a loaded question. I mean, certainly, if you disable the infrastructure, in other words, you don't allow my computer to be connected to a gateway or to the rest of the network, it's going to be very hard to connect. And I did talk, if that's the level of cutting off the internet, then the only solution is basically to use what we call ad hoc communication, which is just to connect with other people like me, and hopefully somebody somewhere would have a link to satellites to the outside world. If you remember, in Egypt, Google did that, allowing people to tweet. I think Twitter, you can tweet by phone because you can have just leave a voice message which gets put on Twitter, basically. However, I don't think that's what people are afraid of. I think what's happening in China is they have these borders, sort of, you know, this is the point where all the traffic goes to the outside world, and you can literally block off access to, let's say, you know, Google or whatever, CNN, or whatever you deem is inappropriate. And the way to deal with that, you mentioned VPNs, there are all sorts of technologies, for example, to allow you to go to a proxy server. So you go to what seems to be a very, you know, innocuous server, but it's taking you to where you want to go. So there are technologies, and I think that I believe that it's rather impossible to really stop access to the internet.
Yeah, my research on this sort of peaked in around 2000, 2001, and my knowledge of China and the sort of technical aspects of their internet control regime is a little outdated, but I can speak more to a general approach that they've taken since the internet really began to be, to spread in the late 1990s. And I think that from what I've seen, this is still consistent. There's a large number of internet content providers. There's a smaller number of internet service providers. They're classified separately in the Chinese regulatory regime, and so those that actually provide network connections are smaller in number, and they have tried to keep a sort of a smaller number of bottlenecks connecting to the outside world and facilitating the ability to flip that switch if they need to. From what we've seen, I think that they're sort of their ability to do filtering of web searches and block websites. And, blocking websites is easy. You can't get them all. You can get the major ones. Blocking based on searches on Google and things like that, and filtering search results is more challenging. The Chinese have been among the best at doing this among the authoritarian regimes that try to, and they certainly have the most practice. But aside from these technological measures of control, what's really been crucial to China's approach for dealing with the internet, and this is since the mid-1990s, is that they use social measures of control in addition to technological ones, and they really rely on social measures of control. So one example is that Chinese police actively participate in internet chat room discussions, and have been for well over a decade. And their role is to monitor, but also to guide the discussion. They want to steer things in a direction that is appropriate or considered appropriate. And they have quite an ability to do this to sort of turn a particular sentiment, sort of stir up nationalist sentiment in a way that becomes pro-China rather than than anti-China. And so this type of thing, also holding internet service providers legally responsible for what people do with their internet connections. There's quite a few mechanisms of control that have worked well that do not actually need to involve flipping a switch.
Taylor, I wonder if I could just ask you to tell the audience briefly what you told me the other week about showing pictures in your comparative politics class of Tiananmen Square and the...
Yeah, I'm teaching Introduction to Comparative Politics this semester, and we typically have some Chinese students each year. And on the first day of class, so what I was telling you about the importance of succession mechanisms and the stability of authoritarian regimes was one of the examples that I began with in class, and I showed pictures of the four leaders: Ben Ali, Gaddafi, Mubarak, and Hu Jintao. And I was asking the students, what are the differences among these leaders? And then, we got into a discussion of how they came to power. But as I was talking about China and how China has withstood repeatedly protests and what in other regimes led to their downfall, I showed pictures of I showed the famous pictures of the lone protester standing in front of the tank in Tiananmen Square. And I made some comments like, you probably are all quite familiar with this image. And afterwards, one of my teaching fellows, a graduate student that assist in the course, is from China. And he came up to me and he said, the Chinese students have probably never seen that photo before. And I spent years studying this phenomenon, and yet it was shocking to me. I was like, really? Someone that comes to school in the US? I just assume that people like that have access to international networks of people and stuff. And he said that he, as a Chinese student now studying in the US, had not seen it until he came here. So, that says something. Okay,
well, now we're going to open it up for questions and comments from you. In the usual professorial way, I'm going to say, do what I say, not what I did. And in particular, make sure that you have a microphone and that it's working before you ask the question.
Hi, thanks again for this. This is really interesting, and it's exactly what I study. I have a bunch of questions, but I'll ask one. You, Professor Boas, you talked about the ability of traditional forms of media and the linkage they have with newer forms of media, and they can amplify certain events. And I'm just wondering, in your opinion, do you feel like there's a pattern between the strength or weakness of the link between newer and more traditional forms of media and the type of authoritarian regime that it's operating in?
You're talking about traditional media, traditional national media?
Yeah. Do you feel like traditional media and new media and how they interact with each other, is it different in China versus a place like Egypt versus a place like Tunisia based on the type of regime?
I think that probably is, although what I was making reference to and what's really most significant here concerns international media, right? It was Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya that were the broadcasters of these images and were taking the YouTube videos and broadcasting them. And so I think that in that regard, Mubarak, as Azer mentioned, had control over the local media and until the very end, I guess. What was more significant were television stations that he did not have direct control over, and that have some legitimacy among the populations that they're communicating with, because they're not tools of the West, right? That I think that broadcasting the same video is likely to be seen as more likely to be truthful, by people that are seeing those. So. I guess that, yeah, it doesn't directly get at your question. I don't have a strong sense of the variation in terms of Chinese online newspapers and television stations and the degree to which they link up with social media versus those in Egypt. But I do think the biggest phenomenon involves the international media that have fewer restrictions.
Just a note about the national media in Egypt. There would be hundreds of thousands of people in Tahrir Square, and they will be looking at another little square where there's some pro-Mubarak people, and that's what they will be taping, or like a picture of the Nile, and everything is fine. And that got people really angry, and because they knew what was happening. They didn't need to see the picture. But the TV was like everything is dandy. So I think that it's funny because, you know, social media was, you know, checking these traditional tools of trying to project an image that's not true.
I don't know your names, unfortunately, but who would like to ask the next question? Yes, this gentleman in the middle.
I was wondering how anonymity has an impact on this. In the past, when people tried to communicate their personal opinions about political systems and about tyrannies, they were easily identifiable. They could be hunted and searched out. But with a lot of this social media, isn't it true that the fact that one could be anonymous might actually potentially be a much more potent, corrosive agent in getting rid of tyrannies?
I think so. I think so. I think the one thing I want to just highlight is anonymity is hard. In other words, you know, even if you get a fake name and put a fake birthday and all that, it's still very easy to track who you are and where you are. So because you're using an infrastructure that the government has. So I think one of the lessons, or maybe one of the things I like to say, is that as we use the internet, especially for those in countries with you know, repressive regimes, etc., it's a danger. It's almost like using something that can really hurt you because you have to know what you're doing and you have to use the right. So there are ways to do anonymity, but it's not as simple and certainly not. But I agree with you that, and this is one of the challenges we have in computer science, is to provide anonymity that we can trust, really.
You know, I have tended over the years to sort of get more skeptical of the notion that simply you know, sharing opinions is enough, right? I think that that use of the internet as a logistical tool is absolutely crucial in these events, right? It's a logistical tool to get people out into the streets where their anonymity is no longer, you know, really there, right? They're showing their faces. That's what brings down authoritarian regimes. Another thing that can bring down authoritarian regimes is getting information out to the outside world to allow, you know, greater monitoring of what's going on, right? So the repressions are not swept under the rug. That might be done anonymously, right? And that's one way in which people are more protected. But, you know, simply sort of anonymous postings of political opinions on, you know, on a Twitter feed or something like that, I don't think that alone is enough. It has to spur concrete action, and at that point, people give up their anonymity.
Thank you. This gentleman at the front, perhaps. I'll come to you.
You spoke about many-to-many relationships in social media, and yet you use words like tool or tools. And I think about a tool as not something that a mob would use or a group of people would use, but rather that an individual would use. And so that leads me to the question, what about the one-to-many relationship? In other words, when you look at the potential for social media to perform something like the functions that you can manage with radio and television, if you had a particularly charismatic speaker, if you had a Hitler, what would happen? I mean, it's a pretty open-ended question, but I can't think of a better way to ask it.
Yeah, I mean, it amplifies voices, right? Now, Hitler controlled all of the broadcast media in Germany, right? So if you didn't like it, you sort of still had to tune in. If your initial inclination was, I'm not interested in politics, you still tuned in, and then maybe you were swayed by the charisma, right? And so I do think there's much more sort of a marketplace of ideas and messages out there. And I do think you would have to be really charismatic in many contexts to get people to, you know, to pay attention to a message of a political leader as opposed to, you know, someone else. But if they can do that, I think that that's certainly a possibility.
Yeah, I just want maybe to add another thought to this, which is when I was following all these friends and people I was following, there were few that actually spoke less than others, but you wanted to read what they have to say. So I think there is actually something about how much you post and the quality of what you post. Some of the people were just forwarding everything they get, and and then they were not. They're good hubs. They're good place for the information to disseminate. That's a good way to go from spread the information. But you can actually look at social media and you can almost tell the actors. Like, this person actually is very influential, even though they don't speak a lot. This person is influential by virtue of how they, how many people they communicate with, etc. So I think yes, that could happen, but it would not be effective if it were not for the other people who forward and act as hubs for this information to propagate.
Is the gentleman in the Boston University shirt here?
So I would like to ask both your takes from the political perspective and from a more technical, with the computers, on WikiLeaks, which I don't think has been mentioned up to now. What do you think about the whole phenomenon that started with Assange and his whole team? And if you think a potentiality of a different kind, basically if you think that such a scheme can work in a better way in the future, because it had its negative side effects as well as the knowledge that it dispersed.
Yeah, it did. I mean, it's interesting to see the sort of multiplicity of messages that you see coming out of U.S. officialdom about freedom of information, right? And this is one context in which it is not appreciated, and yet they speak so openly and enthusiastically about the importance of freedom of information in Egypt and Tunisia and so on. And it's sort of hard to pick and choose which ones you get.
Well, maybe I'll add something to this, which is, that's a very, we can spend another hour on just WikiLeaks. But I think it shows that computer security is very hard, and that you want to share information. I think you can share if you have the right, technical way to do it. But clearly, what this exposes that what you have to assume that the information is going to leak. That's what you have to assume, unless. So I can understand the need to avoid things like WikiLeaks, but I think that this problem is very hard, and I think that the U.S. government should just appreciate that there will be leakages like that. I don't think it's avoidable.
It also underscores that simple technology can be what causes information to get out, right? I mean, this wasn't some incredibly skilled hacker breaking into U.S. government computers, right? This was using the web as a platform for dissemination, but the actual leaking was via much more traditional means.
Thank you. Lady here. I'm sorry, you've got to wait for the microphone.
Yes, I was thinking about your idea of trust and what the responsibility is for social media in terms of like maybe rating, like who's a reliable source, who's not a reliable source. What?
I mean, this is an excellent question. I think that you go to eBay and you see ranking of people who sell and buy and people leave feedback. That's what I meant by we need more feedback than just I like this article or I like this idea. And I think that there are technologies. So I mean, as a computer scientist, I can tell you that we actually can do this. We can also, so there's a lot we can mine, and there's a lot that we can add to social media to allow for this. The question is that, I mean, we don't walk in the street with a score on our head saying, how reliable we are. So I think there is a question here of whether it will be acceptable. And so technically there are things that can be done. Whether they're really materialized is a different question.
I think from what I've seen, just as an observer, someone who buys a lot of things online and looks at the ratings of people that sell them, or looks at a rating of the product, you either get communities where this is largely the case on eBay, that there's such, because everybody is a member, there's such an incentive not to say anything other than incredibly positive about somebody else, because they can come around and respond negatively to you too. And so you get these sort of incredibly, overwhelmingly positive ratings for everybody, and it's sort of hard to distinguish them. You get that, and then with these product reviews, I find that it brings out the haters and the lovers, right? I mean, if you read a product review piece of technology, it's either 0 stars or 5. And so I don't know if this is a more general human phenomenon about opt-in
but I think with social media is different, because actually in social media I can even do this without having to ask you anything, because I know what you're reading. I know who you're responding to. So I can just observe what you're doing in a social media, and based on that, I can start saying, well, I can attach scores, just in the same way that Google, for example, ranks pages. They don't do it by asking people to rank pages. They do it by analyzing how the pages are linked to each other and who's important in this. So there is a lot of work in data mining and computer science on, for example, identifying who are the authorities in a social network. Who are the best, as I said, communicator, people who spread the information. So I think a lot of this can be done automatically. The question is, so we can actually do that today with things like Facebook and Twitter. But would you accept to have your persona on the web be scored? I think there's a question of what society will accept as, for applications like this.
Sounds like Rate My Professor on a grand scale. I'm sorry.
Looking at the government's responses to each of the recent uprisings, they've all been pretty different. So, for example, at least initially, Mubarak's more sort of passive propaganda-based approach, as opposed to Gaddafi's very strong military approach, or the sort of backfiring of Mubarak's taking down the internet. What do you think regimes have learned from the recent uprisings, as opposed to, or in terms of what works and what doesn't?
Have the West on your side. have rather than NATO bombing you, have the U.S. Trying to minimize the attention. That seems pretty important.
I mean, have a fleet based in your...
Well, yeah, right.
So, it's a great question. Hopefully or luckily, we don't have too many regimes so that you can learn from having a lot of these. So maybe everyone will be slightly different. Just anecdotally, 1 month before the Egyptian revolution, the son of Mubarak was basically being prepared to be the next president. Was in a news conference, and they asked him about Twitter, the fact that, people are, in Facebook there was a page about, no more Mubarak, whatever, the elections were rigged. And he said, and it's recorded, something like, these internet kids, sort of totally belittling the whole movement. And lo and behold, 4 weeks later, that's what did him. So maybe they learn a lesson there.
It's a gentleman here who's been waiting patiently.
Thank you. I had a position in which I had to communicate with people on some touchy situations, and they often would email me or text me things they would never say to my face. So it made me think that when you're utilizing this social media, people who would never have the courage to stand in front of everyone else would, because they are sitting at home, we were talking about how emotional you got with it, say things they're empowered, they get courage. And I think this multiplies the potential leaders or catalysts to revolution who would never be able to function if they actually had to confront people, because you have much different feelings when you're looking at somebody than when you're operating on a computer.
I totally agree with this. And not just that, but as I mentioned, it gives you a perspective that was impossible to get otherwise. Because when you use Facebook, you're not really thinking about the 200 plus friends you have. You are just thinking about so you forget that you added this person or that person. They're just in the crowd. So to me, it's almost like being in the street and shouting, and then everybody can listen.
This lady over here.
This has been a really fascinating presentation and discussion. My question is about, I know, print has been around for 500 years or so, and it's been extremely effective in disseminating communications. Is there now? I realize that this social media moves information a lot faster, so that the speed is you can't compare. But in history, is there any, like all of the leaflets and all of the, I wouldn't say newspapers, because those are too carefully edited by the editor, but for independent printing presses, is there any time in political history that they would have been, not on the scale, but in the effectiveness of overthrowing political regimes or powers?
The role of flyers, bills posted on posts in the days leading up to the American Revolution. I mean, I think, there's a lot of examples of, printing before it became commercialized and involved the, large newspapers and so on was very, similar in some ways to social media. I mean, we move toward, I think there's, we move toward media that are faster, that get messages out to more people, and so there's that trend, right? And then you have a trend within individual media, and you certainly see this with print, and you saw this with the web, right? That you tend to have a trend within individual media from a very kind of grassroots beginning to becoming more commercialized. Right? So I think if you look at the early days of print media, it definitely has some similar political characteristics. It also raises some interesting questions as to where things are going with the newest social media. Certainly, Facebook has plenty of commercializing plans. So
it's not only the size and how carefully the newspaper versus a flyer are. I mean, I hinted, and I really think this is fundamentally different, is this reaction time. I mean, even with a flyer, you still have a day to look at the flyer and decide, or hours. I mean, there's reaction, this feedback loop. And I think that we are, as humans, are wired to be rational on some time scale that is much longer than the time scale of Twitter and Facebook. And I think this amplification, I've seen it. I mean, to the point that I actually have to write to people, think. It's like, count, when the kids are playing, count to 10 and then sort of react. And I think that there's something about that medium that's 140 characters, and it comes and you retweet and you respond. So that time scale, I think, changes how we act. And I think it's in that sense that I said something on, it's almost like chaos, but,
I think there's a gentleman in the middle who was...
I'm thinking about in societies where technology is not such a big, it doesn't have such a big role, whether it's, thinking about stories, and I read in Africa, modern day, where, a spy in the street hears about someone of an opposite political party and goes and uses violence toward them, or in earlier societies where, newspapers and flyers, where the editors would go, the government would go, beat up the editors of newspapers, things like that. Do you see a time where people using Facebook have the government come and kick down their door and catch them, typing a blog and inciting an uprising, and the government really using the internet to closely track them and getting to the point where, maybe it's, 10 years, it's, all of a sudden people are afraid to use the internet to incite uprising?
Well, I mean, that was already done, right? I mean, so in Egypt, they would arrest you and beat you during Mubarak and tell you, what's your password? Why? They want to go to your account to find your friends. So, I mean, so what you're mentioning has happened. And I think that your question is, this going to make people use these media less? I don't know, but it didn't in the case of Egypt.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people out there, right? I mean, that's really what's so powerful about social media. I mean, to take a totally different example, looking at Mexico now with the, reporting on the drug wars, right? The drug lords effectively retaliate against the police and the military. They've completely intimidated mainstream journalists, right? There's some brave journalists that keep on doing what they do, but they can get killed very easily. There's not enough journalists. There's a lot more bloggers out there. And there's been some reporting by bloggers using social media that has really frustrated the drug lords recently, and some retaliation. But there's just, you can't combat that. There's too many people. You can kill some of them, but I don't think you can get enough of them.
So, gentlemen, in the blinding, looking at my direction, it's a blinding light that's shining on us.
So, for corporations like Facebook, not if the government's coercing them or subpoenaing them, but from terms of their own interests, do they want to encourage sort of subversive movements, or would they rather discourage those things if they can?
I think Mark Zuckerberg thinks all information wants to be free, or at least if everybody wants to be connected. I don't think that you certainly see as these corporations become more corporate, right? Their earlier freedom of information at all costs type of ethos can be quite moderated. We've certainly seen this with Google, right? And Yahoo. I mean, there were such high hopes when these Western technology companies started to move into China that somehow take the attitude of the computer science grad students that started Google at Stanford and translate that ethos into China as a whole. I mean, that doesn't happen. And so it's hard to see as Facebook becomes more corporate that it starts to take openly endorse controversial political positions. At the same time, I think they're all sort of in favor of openness in general.
Yeah, I think if you even listen to Twitter's during the revolution, people saying the social media is sort of revolution 2.0 and all that, and you can see that the principles of these companies actually distance themselves from that. They never said it. They think of themselves as tools, and let the information do what it wants.
I've been always interested in the capacity of movements in this country or similar countries to change behavior of corporations in other countries. Most people tell me that conditions in Nike subcontractor plants in Vietnam are much better than in just regular Vietnamese-owned factories that don't have that brand identification, and that if that's the case, it goes to the credit of the people who stood outside Nike towns and protested. And I do wonder whether some of these corporations like Google and Yahoo may still be a bit vulnerable to people in countries like the United States saying, we don't want to do business with a company that is in bed with dictators, or not. Or am I being optimistic again?
Well, I mean, there was some pressure. For example, when Google decided to get out of China on Microsoft. So because Microsoft decided not to. So there was some element of that. I do not know, but I don't think that, I don't know how to answer this. But I want to say something else, maybe related to this point. Companies are very aware of their public image, and now all these big companies, they're putting their ears into Twitter and Facebook because they realize that the reputation on the line, and they try to counter any implication that they are being, manipulative or so. I think the companies realize that is important. Whether or not it would affect how they behave in other countries, I don't know.
Okay.
Sorry, I was going to say I think that certainly Nike's factories are to local factories as Google is to Chinese internet firms, right? I mean, I think there's definitely some influence of Western pressure on the decisions that these firms make. I mean, they're not completely collaborating 100% heart and soul with authoritarian regimes.
Thank you. I'll come back to the gentleman here hasn't had a chance.
On the China theme, Professor Boas, in your comments, I think you were taking us down the road that regimes that had planned succession were less vulnerable to social media. And you might have, maybe I missed it, but it seemed like you referred to China specifically. And I wondered if you could connect the dots for us, why that's the case.
I think there are a number of factors that matter in the stability of authoritarian rule, right? A huge factor is economic performance, right? China is doing much better than these Arab regimes that fell, right? There was a lot of discontent because of high levels of unemployment and a number of economic challenges. That's sort of a huge factor that matters for the stability of authoritarian rule. There are many others. International factors matter, right? We've certainly seen the role of the West mattering in whether Arab states are falling quickly or seem to be effectively withstanding protests. I was just giving one example, which is something I think about and something I was teaching to my comparative politics students earlier this semester, is that we don't doesn't as often come to the forefront of our minds, but it's a big distinction between these Arab states that fell and between authoritarian regimes like China, and that is the stability that's provided by institutionalized succession mechanisms, so that if you are opposed to the powers that are in charge right now, what hope do you have? Is your only chance to get this guy out to overthrow him? Right? Or might you bide your time and see if the next leader that comes along is a little more moderate and you know that there's going to be a change in a few years, right? If you're a rival elite, someone in the army that doesn't really like what this dictator is doing and you've been quiet for a long, long time, are you going to support a coup against him or are you going to wait? And so this has nothing on its own to do with social media, but there are a variety of reasons why regimes may be more vulnerable to collapse, even though you didn't see it for years. Right? And so when use of social media sparks a spontaneous uprising like we saw, then some types of regimes will be more likely to collapse and others will be more likely to survive.
And there was a gentleman in the blue shirt.
Hi, so yeah, during the all these great questions, I can't help but think about when I first started using Facebook and how my peers and I would use it for the means of, let's say, inappropriate things, and then now it's used for revolutions. To what extent can we give Facebook credit for these things happening, or is it more so just these passions boiling over in countries where people are doing what they do best?
I like your second interpretation. Again, they used the communication tools that they had available to them. Have we seen? Did we see similar things happen a decade ago when there was not Facebook available and there was not Twitter available? Absolutely. If you had these tools a decade ago, might there have been more or quicker overthrows of authoritarian regimes or protests against democratic ones? Possibly. Right? Again, I always want to give credit to the people that are the protagonists and pay as much attention to the variety of factors that matter for the stability of authoritarian rule, that matter for how they mount a movement and why it gathers other people. I think that Facebook and Twitter and YouTube helped them do what they did, but I think the people that did are distinct from that.
I mean, the only credit I would give to Facebook is that it does allow exchanges that were impossible before. I tried to hit on this many times. So I think that's I think significant. The fact that I can listen in to discussions that the only way for me to have listened to it was to be part of going to the mosque, or vice versa, or for my Muslim friends to hear what the Christian perspective about what's happening, and that could be very dangerous for us. And that, interestingly, changes how they think about it. All of a sudden, it's like putting yourself in somebody else's shoes. It's hard to do that, and I think Facebook facilitates that. Perhaps because of it's a little bit impersonal. I do not know why, but it certainly is. I would give it credit for this.
This gentleman here in the third row back. Now I'll come back to you.
going back to all these rebellions, you indicated there was a lot of, in Egypt, underlying discontent. And media, everybody got their email, they got their Facebook, and you had this big uprising, and things collapsed. Now, I would like to ask the converse. Would it have happened eventually without media? And more importantly, had the army stood by, would all this media and all this hype have been irrelevant? Because the army would have crushed it. And if I can ask a second part to that, if maybe the first part doesn't make any sense. Well, here's the second part. Now that it has happened, are we going to solve the underlying problems through social media? Do we talk to our friends on the book and see how we think things ought to be distributed in Egypt and how we ought to be governed? Are we going to have? Is that going to be a social media? Is that going to replace elections? Is that going to replace a whole host of things?
That's a very loaded question. Well, I'll tell you. I think I got people to ask me, what are you going to do for Egypt? I mean, I live here comfortably. I have my job. What are you going to do? So this notion of civil responsibility, is you are put on the spot and you feel like I owe something to the country. So maybe in that sense, but I don't know if I think it's going to replace voting or public exchange.
I think part of your question is, Libya is the counterfactual, right? Or you said, what if if the army had not, what if the army had been more loyal to Mubarak? And you certainly see in Libya that there were splits, there were defections, but there were certainly forces that remained loyal to Gaddafi. And what did it take? I mean, it took a lot of fighting. It took assistance from NATO. It took a NATO bombing campaign as well as a long, drawn-out military campaign between rebels and those troops that stayed loyal to Gaddafi. And so, transitions can happen that way as well, but sort of more difficult, messier, and in all of these cases with a very certain outcome. I mean, I think if there's one lesson from stretching from the fall of communism through the present day, it's that it may be hard to bring down authoritarian regimes, but it's even more difficult to build democracy and a functioning society in the aftermath, right? And we've seen failures and successes from the fall of communism up through Iraq and Afghanistan, and I think that there are going to be real challenges in these regimes that are being constructed from scratch going forward.
And you can see that happening today in Egypt.
Yeah, and these challenges go so far beyond what any type of media, new social media, traditional whatever, can contribute.
Right in the middle at the back. I'll come to you first. Okay.
Thank you. My question is, yes, I agree that in these uprisings, social media has a very effective role. So why not this social media is used by the other part, the people on the other end, for their own purposes? And related to this question is, there is another question that we have seen that in these uprisings, social media has been very effectively used. So why not we use social media to propagate or to achieve some better revolution, some green revolution, some peace revolution around the world, or something like that? Why not? There are more bright and dedicated people for that, for those causes as well. So why don't they use this social media that effectively?
I think if you went and you interviewed the Occupy Wall Street or Occupy Boston protesters right now, they would tell you that they are, right? And it becomes a question as to whether or not you sympathize with their aims and with their methods. But that's one example of something other than overthrowing an authoritarian regime that has generated a lot of excitement and has made use of social media.
I want to go to your first question about, how about the other side? Did they use it and why did they not use it? They actually used it. They tried. Just in the same way, there were counter-protests that are pro-Mubarak. It's just that one is 1 million and the other one is 20,000. Same thing with Facebook. They had pages, they had their Twitter, and all that. So to me, it's interesting. It's almost like social media is the platform on which, so instead of going to the street, you go to the social media and you sort of protest. So I think they used it. It just didn't work.
And we're going to have to end after this question, but Gerald, you wanted to...
Thank you. Yes, I'm thinking about the future, let's say, 100 years from now. And I'm thinking, are things like Facebook and Twitter really democratic at their core, or are they simply evolutionary? Are we looking at something that will help in the survival of the fittest, as Darwin would have put it, but not necessarily something democratic? I'm advancing a theory. And what do you think the future will look like? Let's say we all had cranial implants and we all had peer-to-peer networks, or the ad hoc networks you spoke so clearly about. What would we have with, I guess, not just Facebook and Twitter, but really all of electronic communications?
Can I leave it to the tech guy to speculate about cranial implants?
Well, you know what I'll do in this world is I'll put myself in a house made of metal, so that all the communication doesn't reach me, because I'll probably go crazy. I think that certainly technology can give you, for example, an immediate real-time pulse of what people think. So if you consider that to be democracy, sure, you can find out what people want right now at this minute. And perhaps in the future that will be very easy to gauge. It's like, there will be a mirror showing what people think about every possible, topic. But I don't know if that's democracy. As a matter of fact, and I meant to say this, that one of the things that I didn't like in my experience in social networks is that I was dazed. I didn't know if I was thinking for myself. I mean, it's what I try to say, the sort of the crowd mentality. It's just noisy, right? Now, that may get people to the street and that may topple governments, but it doesn't get people to talk to each other about what they want. I remember with very young students here at BU were very excited about the revolution. And I asked a question. So you are going to protest together. Did you even talk about what might Egypt look like in 6 months? Do you even know? And the answer was no. They didn't. And you see it today in Egypt, where it's a question, and it's going back to the point about, well, is it going to actually building democracy is much harder than taking down authoritarian regimes.
Yeah, I agree. Democracy is not a natural state of human affairs that can be created just by removing impediments or giving people the technology that allows them all to speak, right? And so I think that I go back to the many-to-many, one-to-many. They're a technology that can be controlled from a single point, right? Broadcast media are more amenable to authoritarian control than technologies, the means of communication being naturally dispersed, right? So in that sense, I think that social media, like cell phones and text messaging and email, are more democratic, right? But that's a very qualified statement of their democraticness, and building a democracy is much, much harder than having a technology widespread that has those characteristics.
I would say they're equalizers, just equalize, but I don't know if they lead to democracy or that what comes out of them is an expression of democracy. I don't know.
Well, there is so much more that we could talk about. One of the questions that I hoped we'd get to, but we haven't had time, is the question of whether it's ever legitimate to disable things like cell phone communication. There was a lot of talk during the London riots about whether they should have shut down the system so that rioters couldn't communicate with each other where to go next and outflank the police. I think perhaps an even more compelling case for saying, or a more compelling case for saying it might be legitimate, was in the question in the Bay Area about whether they could shut down cell phone access when people were arranging demonstrations on BART platforms, which could be argued to be could be dangerous to assemble large crowds of protesters on a subway platform. And I know the other side, but I just think it's always good if you've got both sides to have a question. Now, the good thing about having more questions that we could have talked about is that after this, there is the opportunity to continue the conversation, and there is a reception. I hope the speakers will be able to stay a little bit. I certainly will be able to, and I'm sure that we'll be able to talk among ourselves informally about these questions and questions which we didn't have time to get to tonight. I want to thank you all for coming on yet another rainy, drizzly evening. And if you enjoy this type of event, we hope that you'll come again to the next Discoveris Lecture, which is on Thursday, December the 1st. And William Carroll of the English department will be talking about my favourite Shakespeare play, The Tempest, and its impact on early America. I love the play, although I must say that the geography is a little bit disconcerting because it's clearly a Caribbean island, but it seems to be remarkably close to Milan so that the Duke's family can get back there. But nonetheless, that's the next event, and I think Bill Carroll is a great speaker, and I think that will be a really fascinating presentation. We hope to see you at that as well as future alumni events. And last but not least, I'd like to thank both of our speakers for such interesting questions and responses to such interesting questions that you've asked, their interesting responses to them, and such wonderful presentations from them to begin with. So thank you both very much.